Hail the Barbarian Horde. Here is my first indie fantasy review for you all. It's The Citadel of the Seven Swords, and this is a book that I actually found coming out of the gate I kind of liked, but while I am friends with the writer, Eric Wegg, or at least I've become friendly with him via Substack, where I'm basically spending all my time these days, and Twitter, the truth is I have some minor quibbles. Now, let's get the good stuff out of the way. The good stuff's really good. So, we're introduced in the beginning of the story to a character called Skard. And Skard is basically a Norseman, just in a fantasy world, sword and sorcery world. And Skard is someone who, at the beginning, is a slave serving on a galley. Now, Skard himself is mostly modeled after, to an extent, Kull, as he goes from a slave on a galley to then escaping in the woods and ending up a gladiator for a short time, and then basically a kind of knight. So he's following a lot of the ideas of Kull, the king from Howard's Legendarium. But at least with Skard, we're actually seeing the journey. With Kull, we didn't see the journey, we just saw the end to a large extent, although we saw a bit of the journey, just a little, from bad king to good king. But, well, not really bad king, but you know what I mean. Skard, though, is a character who has a nature similar to Conan. In some ways, he's Conan Lite, if I'm being honest. He has a huge passion for women and for food and the joys of life. And given that he's Norse, in this regard, it does separate him from Conan. And I really like that. I like it when he's calling out the names of like Thunir and Hotan and all the rest. This is a solid point in favor of this book because he's not simply Conan. He's his own character. But there's enough similarities that you can kind of see Conan's influence there. Same with Kull. So that's some good stuff. The prose is pretty good. I'm not going to lie. I really like the prose. And arguably, I find it better than some pastiche Conan stories I've read. So in this regard, it would be nice to see what Eric Wegg could do with in a few years with Conan. And I'm also impressed with how the lore functions and how he kind of has some of the magic work with hypnotism. But at the same time, he includes, spoilers alert, a giant at the end for a great fight with the lead. So this is something that harkens back to Frost Giant's daughter, and I really do like this. Except I find that the fight here with the giant is even more epic and even more, how shall I put it? You hold your breath a lot more during it than the Conan fight with the Frost Giants. I'm just going to be honest. I really like that fight at the end. So that's me gushing about that. The good stuff is really good. And the characterization is pretty good. He gives nicknames to the characters like Peg Leg or something, or whatever his name is. And the thing is about some of these characters is that this fits with the Legendarium and how the prisoners, because yes, there are prisoners, I'm not going to reveal everything, kind of regard their captors. That said, Skard, his friends are also fellow slaves, and most of them make the dash for freedom once he does, and then end up captured by the gladiatorial arena folk. That it's basically underground, and it's very Howardian. I'm just going to say that. I really do like that element. Now, this book was edited by Daniel Riley, a friend of Dan and mine, who's going to be editing a book of our own. And you can tell the editing is pretty good at most parts, and the writing is, of course, rock solid. Now, the only problem I have is ironically with a major character, Solmi, the Asiatic sex kitten, who seduces Scarred. Because now, at the start, I didn't mind her, I didn't care. But as the story progresses, there are some positives with her. She becomes ever more mysterious, and by the end, you're convinced she's not human. In this regard, it's really well written. So that I have the suspicion she's actually a dragon in human flesh. And I'm hoping I can confirm or get him to deny this later when I interview him. Yes, I'm going to be interviewing Eric Wegg at some point down the road. But the trouble I have with Solmi is that while she's very evidently just in it for herself and half the time basically not really being an outright ally of Scarred and potentially screwing him over, Scarred is just utterly blind and doesn't care and is so love struck it's almost buffoonish at a few points. Now, on the other hand, I get what's trying to be done here, and this is obviously set up for a second book. And I suspect she's probably going to appear as a villain later, or at least turn against Scarred. And I appreciate that. So, in that regard, it's a minor quibble. I just get tired of him just constantly lusting after her throughout the book. But that itself isn't like it's not something that's a deal breaker, I find, with the novel. So while I don't like Solmi as a character, she doesn't really entice me, I guess. And she just seems as backstabbing as Carolus or Danglars from Alex Dumas. She's got potential as a character, I'll say that much. Scarred himself has potential as a character. This was a good intro book to the world, but I'd much rather I just want him to follow up with a second book soon so I could at least follow things up with that. All that aside, as for the actual novel, from 0 to 4, 0 being beyond the pall, 4 being perfection, I'm going to say this is a 2.1. It's above average. But while, okay, let's be honest. It's basically a 4 for indie fiction because indie fiction isn't always well edited. I myself can admit to that a lot of my work isn't always the best edited stuff over on Substack. This is obviously better edited than some of my stuff. But on the other hand, for traditional fantasy up until the end of the 80s and whatnot, this is a 2.1 book. So this could probably stand tall with that crowd. I'd probably compare it to something like in terms of quality, some of the Conan books and pastiches I've read, and also compare favorably with some of the Dragonlance novels. To be quite honest, I really love almost all the Dragonlance novels, even the really bad ones. But this one stands tall alongside some of them. It's not Legend of Huma, but it's something that's probably about as compelling as, say, the Elf trilogy with Kif Kanan. Although, like I said, it's roughly comparable in terms of quality. Although this is a very different kind of story. That was a very historic fantasy epic where you get to see a lot of the different sides. And eventually it just ground down because Kif Kanan's love life just becomes a disaster. And while I do love that trilogy, there are some minor issues I have with that as well. Especially Kif Kanan going back to his ex, which makes no sense. But this is roughly comparable with the quality of those books, I find. Except it's sword and sorcery. And to be honest, I hold the Call the Conqueror novel above this, but I hold this way above Conan the Liberator. So I'm going to address Eric directly. Kudos to you. You did a great job. I think it's only going to go up from here because I suspect this was just set up for book 2. And I hope there's a book 2. Otherwise, I'm going to look like a bit of a buffoon here, which, more of the norm. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to not only smash that like and subscribe button here, but go check out Eric Wagg's channel, as he's got his own, and I'll post it up in the description.